The neighborhood gossip started as a whisper. Someone was digging. Not for a pool, not for a septic, something deeper. The whisper swelled into a chorus the day a backhoe hummed outside my fence, and two men in hard hats unfolded blueprints. Like they were opening presents. I was building a storm shelter, a simple, reinforced underground bunker. Call it prudence, after two tornado seasons that knocked out power for days. I wanted a safe place for my family and the old Labrador. I filed the permits, got the county inspector's nod, and paid for the engineers to stamp their initials where it counted. Of course, the dig didn't stay private. The problem wasn't the bunker. The problem was Karen. Karen was the sort of Hoa president who wore authority the way some people wear perfume thick. Obvious. Impossible to ignore. She chaired meetings like she was conducting an orchestra. Sent emails in all caps that felt like subpoenas, and had a network of neighbors who answered her calls faster than prayer. When she saw my backyard turned into a temporary construction site, she looked like a woman who'd found a stain on a wedding dress, offended, indignant, and ready to perform. Underground structures aren't allowed, she announced the moment. She marched up my driveway, clipboard balanced like a shield. You didn't tell the Hoa. This will lower our property values. I showed her the permit. I smiled and said the words that usually cut through Hoa rage. County approved. She sniffed like the county was a rumor. Those permits don't matter to us, she said, eyes cooling into a glare that meant she had already written the narrative she wanted. Her eyes flicked to the workmen and then to the hole in the ground. And I watched, with the strange thrill people get watching a slow-motion car crash, as her plan shifted from rules to performance. This was no longer simply about bylaws or setbacks. For Karen, the community was a stage and she had to be the lead. Asterisk for 2 days the cul-de-sac became a theater. Neighbors came by to watch the progress and, occasionally, to ask if they could borrow my generator. Karen paraded like she was handing out citizenship tests. She pulled up HOA covenants, pointed to lines about structures, and read them with the sanctimony of a late-night televangelist. I answered calmly, again and again. Yes, the shelter was permitted. Yes, it followed setbacks. Yes, the county inspector had already stamped his approval. Facts didn't dent her conviction because the whole thing had never been about facts. I started to document everything because community rumor has the durability of wet tissue. I took pictures, filed emails, and saved the text messages where she told me unprompted that my bunker idea would scare off buyers and was unneighborly. That last message I saved for taste. It felt absurdly theatrical for someone who once voted to repaint the clubhouse beige. Her escalation was swift. She began emailing neighbors with worrywart bulletins, safety hazard, unknown occupant, potential liability, and then posted a cautionary note in the neighborhood Facebook group. People who'd never met me in person speculated about stockpiling and weird subsurface activity. Someone asked, in all caps, if I was a survivalist prepping to take over the cul-de-sac. Karen let the speculation ripple out like a pebble and then feigned shock at the waves. I invited the Hoa to inspect. I left my permit folder on the kitchen table like evidence. I told them the county inspector had already approved the site. The audacity of disagreement escalated to something close to hysteria when Karen told a neighbor she had reached out to the police because she was concerned about possible illegal construction. It felt like a bad sitcom until the blue lights cut the afternoon like a stage cue. I opened the door to two uniformed officers standing on my porch, casual and professional in a way that made Hoa Theatrix feel tiny. I handed them the permit packet, the glossy county seal, stamped signatures, the dated inspection logs that would make any bureaucrat smile. They read, their faces a slow weather map from dutiful attention to the amused sympathy reserved for petty squabbles. Miss Henderson called 911, one officer said. Looking up briefly, Karen was assembled across the way with a small audience, narrating loudly about secret bunkers and ruining neighborhood safety. She assumed calling the police would give her moral high ground. She was wrong. Everything seems in order here, the second officer said, closing the folder. You've got county permits, engineering plans all signed off. Any reason you thought she'd be allowed to make these claims? She's worried about aesthetics, I replied, the phrase tasting like a polite way to say vindictive. The lead officer smiled, kind or patronizing. I couldn't tell, but his next sentence landed with the unromantic gravity of reality. We take reports seriously, but filing false reports is a thing, too. Karen bristled. I'm not filing false. You told Dispatch you believed this structure was illegal. The officer interrupted. We checked. It's not. If you continue to file complaints without evidence, you could be cited for nuisance complaints or misuse of emergency services. There was a ripple through the assembled neighbors, a collective intake of breath. Karen tried to pivot to public safety, a rhetorical shield, but the officer already held the map. Law, permits, common sense. There was a stifled laugh from someone who'd followed the Hoa saga for months, the kind of laugh that's less mean than exhausted, and Karen's bravado began to wobble. Then came the turn nobody expected. One of the officers, a man with laugh lines and a sheriff's patch, that had seen too many summers, crouched at the bunker entrance and asked, Mind if I see inside? I blinked and then led them down a tidy flight of stairs. The bunker was clean and purposeful. Poured concrete, a small water tank, a hand crank radio, a stack of canned goods, first aid supplies, and a laminated list of emergency contacts. It was practical, not dramatic. The officer ran his hand along the wall and said, almost reverently, This is the kind of thing we want people to build. Karen watched from above, arms crossed like a critic failing to hide her boredom. The officer walked up to her and, with the mix of firmness and a soft smile that makes a point without shouting, said, You see this? This is not a threat. This is preparation. Then, quieter, but still audible, You might want one. She flinched as if struck. It was a tiny admission of vulnerability, and in that small flinch, the story she'd been telling about underground things equaling danger began to unravel. People don't fear concrete. They fear uncertainty, and here was something that reduced uncertainty. The lead officer then reframed the moment in a way that had teeth but no theatrics. Mum, We're happy to intervene when crime's suspected. We're not here to police. Taste. If you're worried, talk to Mr. Alvarez, learn from him. If you keep using dispatch to settle Hoa politics, we'll document it. It was the straightforward demotion of a performance. Karen's mouth worked, but the words would not assemble into the spectacle she'd imagined. The crowd's sympathy shifted, and in that soft movement I felt something loosen. 3 weeks later. The storm came, dark clouds like a curtain, alerts screaming on phones. Power flickered and died. Wind rattled windows until they complained. I called my family and followed the routine the shelter had been built for. Neighbors who had once exchanged conspiratorial glances at my fence began pounding on my door. We learned strange hierarchies during emergencies. All the petty ones slide off like rain. Karen arrived, hair wind-blown, eyes wide. She looked less like a crusader and more like someone pleading with the person she'd tried to embarrass. She pulled out her phone and, hesitating, said the question she'd never asked at a board meeting. "Please, do you have room?" I hesitated the way people do when pride and moral obligation collide. But the practical truth is plain. I had built the bunker to keep people safe, not to spite anyone. I opened the hatch. Neighbors shuffled in. The kid who mows lawns, the retired teacher who votes for every Hoa measure, the builder from 2 houses down. We sat shoulder to shoulder, shared canned peaches, chewed jerky, and listened to a battery-powered lantern hum. Some expected a triumphant speech. I gave none. There's a smaller, purer satisfaction in handing out water than in posting a public takedown. Later, the Hoa board discussed the incident and a motion to apologize for the false alarm passed with a chorus of mumbled assent. Karen wrote an email about misunderstandings and promised to be more careful. Whether she truly meant it, people would watch and learn. The bunker became less a scandal and more a civic asset. We organized a disaster prep workshop at the clubhouse. The sheriff's department came by and quietly praised the planning, and people who once circulated gossip now swapped battery brands. Life went on, quieter and, surprisingly, more prepared. Not everything repaired itself overnight. A neighborhood is an ecosystem. Old grievances mix with new loyalties. After the police visit and the storm, a few neighbors reached out privately to apologize. One woman I'd barely spoken to left a thermos of coffee on my porch with a note, "Sorry for believing the loudest voice." Small gestures like that held more weight than any Hoa bulletin. The board adopted a sensible guideline for reporting safety issues. Attach evidence. Don't use emergency lines for Hoa disputes. At our first preparedness meeting, the sergeant who'd been at my house said, with perfect dry humor, "We're not the Hoa hotline," and then walked everyone through things that actually matter: where to store water, who has a generator, when to call. Practical, boring, and useful. I found myself helping neighbors quietly. How to keep permits handy, document communication, and stay calm in the face of drama. My teen asked if I'd been scared when the lights flashed in the driveway. "A little," I said. "Mostly I was tired of noise. You don't need to shout to be right." Time softened the sting. The shelter became part of the neighborhood fabric. a workshop site, a soft reassurance in bad weather, a conversation starter at block parties. The sheriff's department offered community CPR training. A local reporter wrote a short piece, framing the shelter as a communal resource. Someone taped the clipping to the Hoa board with a magnet shaped like a small sun. And I laughed out loud. Karen's shouting matches lost some of their power. She still ran meetings and scolded about parking, but when the topic turned to severe, whether she listened. Once, in a boardroom full of people, she asked for a tour. It was a late, small admission with more value than the 1,000 critiques she'd offered. I told her I'd show it after she promised not to call dispatch for petty grievances. She agreed. Progress is often quiet. 2 years later, my daughter organized a bunker sleepover. Kids with flashlights played tag, told exaggerated ghost stories, and learned how to use a hand crank radio. Karen's grandson came, curious and quiet. At the end of the night, Karen approached me with no clipboard in hand and placed a jar of pickled peppers in mine. For the pantry, she said, a jar, a small smile, nothing dramatic. But it felt like a truce. The bunker never became an attraction, and I never wanted it to be. It's a practical answer to a noisy world. The real victory wasn't humiliation or spectacle. It was neighbors checking in, sharing batteries, and volunteering for drills. The police visit had been awkward, humiliating for some, but it prodded us into something better. Less performance, more preparation. If you take anything from this, let it be simple. Do the work quietly, keep your records, and refuse to let fear be weaponized. If your Hoa president comes with a crusade, offer coffee instead of a fight. Maybe she'll accept. Maybe she won't. But sometimes the smallest acts, a thermos, a jar of peppers, a seat at a meeting are what rebuild a neighborhood.